we can actually use reasons explanation as a very significant kind of theoretical foothold from which to understand intentional action. And this is it's a very intriguing and, to my mind, interesting and potentially fruitful idea, although here I'm going to sort of give a sort of a negative assessment of it. But the idea, I guess, is to say something really important about intentional action, its nature, its concept, without, for example, relying on a talk of mental states like desire and belief pairs or intention, and the relationship between mental states and behaviors of the agent. So there's a sort of a social ambition here to give a kind of a social account of intentional action and to steer clear of kind of traveling inward into the mind and then trying to wrestle with issues like the causal relations between intention and bodily behavior that's bodily or mental behavior that's intentional. So because I'm not going to talk about Anscombe specifically, I'm going to take this claim, kind of DF claim or distinguishing feature claim, as I call it, as sort of inspired by what Anscombe says. And I take it that it's a claim that quite a few philosophers of action would accept. And I think it is also widely thought that intentional action is action for reasons. That these kind of expressions, intentional action and action for reasons, are often used interchangeably. And I think that idea, the idea that these are basically one and the same thing, is undergirded by a claim like DF claim. So it's precisely because intentional action is, or is paradigmatically action for reasons, that we can say that what it is to be an intentional action is to be a kind of action for which a certain kind of question is given application to it. And as I said, I think for some philosophers, there's a sort of a theoretical ambition with something like DF claim. It's to illuminate the nature or concept of intentional action by appeal to this kind of independently given, identifiable social practice. And in the talk today, I'm going to talk about or-e questions, or-e answers, the reasons explanation practice. And what I have in mind by this is a kind of social epistemic practice that's referred to in the literature by lots of different terms: action explanation, rationalizing action explanation, and so on and so forth. And the idea in this talk is to argue that DF claim is false. And even if some version of DF claim is true, and I'm going to suggest alternative ways of cashing it out, even if some version of it is true, it's not going to deliver on the sort of the ambition, the theoretical promise that I think some philosophers, and I think Anscombe was one of them, have thought that a claim like DF claim could deliver. Okay, so first, just a couple of clarificatory points. One is how to characterize reasons explanation, or the or-e practice, as I'm calling it. And this is very difficult. As we've seen, Anscombe talks about reasons, and she talks about why questions. The kind of questions that I have in mind are, why are you leaving when we see somebody leaving a party? Or why are you, baking a cake? Or why are you doing that as opposed to something else? But very often we don't use a why question. We'll say something like, what are you doing? So it's not easy to sort of capture this kind of practice in terms of a particular kind of why question. And I think it would take a bit of work to try to dig down and establish that, these are all fundamentally a specific kind of why question. Anscombe also talks about reasons, and many people do too. But as I'm sure you know, there's a huge literature on reasons, and specifically on what is meant by reasons in this context. Whether we're talking about psychological states like desire, whether we're talking about kind of states of affairs of the world, have a kind of a normative authority, that favor our doing the thing in question, whether we're talking about social rules, because sometimes we'll answer a question by saying a question about why we're doing something by pointing out that there's some rule that we're acting in accordance with, like, well, I have to do it this way. That's what the rules require of me. So it's not easy to characterize the ORI practice, but I am going to assume with Anscombe and others that there is a kind of identifiable kind of practice. Here, Davidson characterizes the practice, or at least I take this as his aim here, not so much in terms of why questions or in terms of reasons, although he does, of course, rely in much of his work on this kind of psychologistic understanding of reasons. But here he also sort of asks us to pay attention to the epistemic aims, as it were, of the inquirer, of the person who asks the question, what are you doing? Or why are you doing that? What is it that you're aiming at? And the idea he has here, and I think it's plausible, and I think it's widely accepted, that what the inquirer is trying to do is come to see what good or positive or valuable thing the agent saw in her intentional action. So this gives us, I think, a clue as to what's going on. But because of the short talk today, I won't say much more by way of an attempt to sort of characterize in some sort of very neat and convincing way how to understand this RE practice. But I will come back to these ideas about reasons and what Davidson says here about the aim of the RE inquiries. Just again, sort of a second clarificatory point before getting to the main agenda. So I'm going to use some terminology in the talk. So if we look at this case, tarts, why did you steal the tarts? And the answer, A1, I didn't steal the tarts. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to distinguish between direct and corrective answers. So corrective answers, like A1, they contradict a presupposition of the question. And I'm going to rely on this direct and corrective idea in the talk. And then when a presupposition is false, I take it that the inquiry expressed by a question is faulty and it lacks a true direct answer. So I'm going to accept that here. I'm also going to rely on another distinction between sound and unsound questions. So a sound question is one that defines a set of answers and at least one of the set is true, but an unsound question lacks a true direct answer. So for example, in the case of tarts, the way I'm thinking about it is that the question defines a set of answers. For example, I stole the tarts because they look so good. I stole them because I wanted to prevent the Queen of Hearts from eating them, and so on and so forth. And when a question is unsound, none of the answers that's defined by the question is true. Okay, so with those preliminaries in place, let's come back to DF claim and whether we should accept it. So the claim is, if A is an intentional action, then an ORI question, one of our why questions, why are you doing that? What are you up to? Is given application to A. And here I'm relying on Anscombe's I think it's Anscombe's coinage, I think it's original to her, this idea of a question being given application. And I think to try to better understand what's going on in DF claim, we need to think about what it is for one of these questions to be given application. So that's what I'm going to consider now. So as I understand DF claim, it concerns successful intentional actions. And presumably then, it also concerns successful ORI inquiries. Okay, so you've got an intentional action. It is a thing to which a why question is given application. And I take it the questions that are at stake are successful inquiries. They express successful inquiries. And as a successful ORI inquiry will be a well-formulated one, and as a soundness is an element in this being well-formulated, I'm going to accept this idea, necessary condition. And I'll refer to this as necessary condition in what follows. If a question that expresses an ORI inquiry is given application to an intentional action, then Q is a sound question. So I'm going to assume that it's a necessary condition on a question has been given application to an intentional action, that it is a sound question. So there's a problem for DF claim, which Anscombe herself brings up very soon after she says the thing that I quoted at the beginning of my talk. And she points out that, of course, a possible answer to the question why is one like, I just thought I would, or it was an impulse for no particular reason, it was an idle action, I was just doodling. And probably you've thought of this already yourself. There seem to be intentional actions that we perform. And if somebody said to us, why are you doing that? And we were going to be cooperative and sincere, we would say, no reason. And so it seems like a straightforward counterexample to DF claim. We have intentional action, but the why question is not given application. And certainly, if you accept necessary condition, it looks like the question isn't sound in this case, but I'll come to that again in a second. For now, I just want to say that I do think that there are intentional actions for no reason. So let me just motivate this a little bit. I think that, for example, if I were to raise my hand for no reason, I would exercise kind of guidance control over it. I would raise it, I might want to raise it slowly. And I might consider some movements as kind of a failure of mine to kind of do what I had set out to do. So I seem to exercise a kind of control over it. I may have like an act type. It seems like I might even have to have an act type in mind that I'm trying to token, and I employ knowledge how in the tokening of the act type that I have in mind. And I might also have what philosophers of action call, and you may be familiar with this, I might also have practical knowledge of what I'm doing. And practical knowledge, although it's much disputed how to characterize it, is understood as the kind of special epistemic access that an agent has to her intentional action. And she has it just in virtue of the fact that she's the one who's performing the intentional action. It's generally thought to be especially secure. And so some philosophers, although this too is disputed, think that it's a necessary condition on intentional action that you have this kind of special epistemic access to what it is, at least, that you are doing. And so it seems that also in the case of my raising my hand, it seems that I could have practical knowledge. And so when we think about these kinds of cases, it's plausible to think that there are intentional actions, but it also seems possible to just do those things, do some things for no reason. And so if that's right, there is this problem that DF claim faces. Now, Anscombe says, I don't call an answer of this sort a rejection of the question. The question is not refused application, because the answer to it is that there is no reason. Any more than the question, how much money do I have in my pocket, is refused application by the answer, none. Okay, so Anscombe here suggests that there's an analogy, and she wants to argue here, I take it, that these why questions are still given application, even when the answer is no reason. So first, let's briefly look at the analogy that I think she's relying on. In the case of money, somebody says, how much money do you have in your pocket? And the answer is none. And I take it that the question is seeking information about the quantity of money that you have in your pocket. And I take it that when you say I have no money, I have zero money, I take it that is a quantity. It's no money. But the set of answers that's defined by Q2 is I have no money, I have 1 cent, I have 2 cents, and so on and so forth. But it does seem to include an answer like A2. And so Q2 seems at least to be sound, and A2 seems to be, if it's a true answer, it seems to be a direct answer. Now, in the case of no reason, why are you raising your hand? And the answer is no reason. It's not so clear to me that the question is sound and that A3 gives you a true direct answer. So if you think about what Q3 aims at, it's aiming to elicit, using Anscombe's characterization of reasons, using the Davidsonian kind of characterization of what the epistemic aim of the inquirer is. The inquirer wants to see what good or appropriate or valuable or beneficial or obligatory thing there is in the action. And so it seems reasonable that the set of answers that's defined by Q3 would be along the lines of, I raised it because I wanted this or that, or I raised it because I'm trying to catch my friend's attention, and so on and so forth. But the answer, no reason, that is given, and let's suppose it's the true answer, it seems very different to the other members of the set. And in fact, it seems to function in the context to inform the inquirer that none of the members of the set is correct, because from the agent's perspective, there isn't anything that she sees that sort of favors performing the action. She doesn't see any specific good thing or appropriate thing in the action. She's just doing it. So if that's right, then it looks like A3 is a corrective answer. It's not contained in the set, and it's correcting a presupposition of the inquiry, which is that you do see something good in action, you are doing it for a reason, and so A3 looks like it's contradicting that presupposition. And if A3 is corrective, then Q3 is unsound. The question is unsound if it doesn't have any true direct answers. And if Q3 is unsound, then necessary condition is not satisfied for no reason. And if necessary condition is not satisfied for no reason, then the question Q3, for example, is not given an application, although it is an intentional action. And so we seem to be back to the view that DF claim is indeed undermined by these kinds of cases. So yeah, just to sort of briefly recap on that part, Anscombe's analogy at least seems problematic to me and not completely convincing. And then when we think about a case like no reason, and we think about, well, what would be in the set, and then A3 doesn't look like anything in the set. And so we have reason, I think, to think that, in fact, it's not a sound question. And if we accept necessary condition, then we should say that the action is not given application, as long as we accept that necessary condition is a condition on a question's being given application. Okay, now you might think that necessary condition is the problem, and in fact, we shouldn't have accepted that in the first place. There's something wrong with that. And Anscombe says a little bit later that the answers giving ORE questions application are more extensive in range than the answers which give reasons for acting. So she seems to think, at least this, what she says here suggests that she doesn't think that necessary condition is correct. So the challenge now is to say what it is for the question to be given application, even when the question isn't sound. And here's a thought, and the thought is inspired in part by some of Anscombe's work, but also work of other people. The thought is that when a question is given application, it's given application when and only when it elicits the agent's practical knowledge about her intentional action. So it's kind of an interesting feature of ORI questions that they're given application only when they elicit this special epistemic access that the agent has to her intentional action. So, as I mentioned before, practical knowledge, this is rough, but it's widely understood as a kind of special access to an intentional action that's exclusive to the agent who performs the action, and it's intimately related to the practical reasoning on which the agent acts. Okay, and so how to characterize practical reasoning and what the relationship is between practical reasoning and practical knowledge, I set aside, but the suggestion is that ORI questions are given application whenever they elicit practical knowledge. And it might be that this suggestion allows us to kind of distinguish between questions that are given application and those that are not in a sort of kind of an interesting, potentially sort of revealing way. So for example, in the case of no reason, why are you raising your hand? Although we may concede that the question is unsound, nonetheless, the answer does seem to draw on the agent's practical knowledge. So she knows that she's not acting for any further end, let's say, nor is she sort of responsive to some sort of consideration that she thinks favors the action, nor is she sort of acting in accordance with some social rule or something like that. And she knows this because she knows what she's doing, namely she's just raising her hand. So she's answering out of practical knowledge plausibly. And we can contrast this with a different kind of case where somebody says, why are you putting marks on the table? And the answer is, I didn't realize I was doing that. And here, in this case, we might have a sort of an intuition that, well, this is definitely a question that is not given application to the action because it completely mistakes a non-intentional action for an intentional one. And so there's sort of a bigger mistake involved in Q4 than there is in Q3. And we might want to say this definitely is not a case where the question is given application. And the answer, I didn't realize that I was doing that, is also not an answer that needs to come from practical knowledge. The agent simply has to observe that this thing is happening, she's marking the table, but she had no intention to do so. And so you might think we can sort of spell out this idea about practical knowledge in a sort of a fruitful way and kind of make a nice bright line between questions that are given application, questions that aren't, and then also sort of avoid this problem that of actions that are not done for reasons. And so we might characterize DF claim in a bit of a different way. If A is an intentional action, then an ORI question is given application to A by eliciting the agent's practical knowledge. And in no reason Q3 is unsound and A3 is corrective, but Q3 is nonetheless given application. Now, I think there's a problem with this. Note that ORI questions are given application even when they are unsound. That is, even when they rest on mistaken presuppositions about the phenomenon that they're inquiring into. And even when they're sort of seeking to elicit features like reasons or the agent's attitudes or positive evaluation of her action or whatever that are not there. So I guess the first thing to note is that why would we think that a sort of a mistaken inquiry is the kind of thing that can shed light on the kind of the nature or concept of intentional action, which is the sort of the theoretical ambition that drives a claim like DF claim. So that's the first worry. The second thing is that the ORI questions that are mistaken and those that are not are different from one another. One is, mistaken, it rests on false presuppositions, it tries to elicit information about things that are not there, but the other one is different. And what seems to be in common between them is that they're both, on this proposal, is that they're both eliciting practical knowledge. But then it looks like it's practical knowledge, if anything is going to illuminate intentional action, it's not going to be these kind of diverse types of inquiry, it's actually going to be practical knowledge. And it starts to look like the ORI inquiry is of kind of marginal theoretical interest. But if that's right, DF claim PK doesn't preserve the ambition of DF claim. And so this is a reason to think that this is not a very good way to go. And in fact, giving up unnecessary conditions seems to be a part of the problem here. And I wonder how much time I have left. Okay, so.
Yeah, 15 minutes.
Okay, in total.
Including discussion. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So here's an alternative way to spell it out. And this may be something that you've been thinking about as well. I've been suggesting to you that there are intentional actions that are done and they're not done for reasons. But you might think nonetheless that intentional actions that are done for reasons are, in some sense, the paradigmatic case of intentional action. And those that are not done for reasons are somehow like defective qua intentional actions. They're somehow substandard. So you might have something in mind, like what John Schwenkler here says when he's sort of glossing this quotation that I gave from Anscombe earlier. As a pocket is something about which one can sensibly ask, what it contains in a competitive game, something about which one can sensibly ask who won. So an intentional action is something about which one can seek reason-giving explanation. And so the idea I want to suggest here, another alternative way to sort of say DF claim, is that intentional action for reasons is the paradigm case of intentional action. And so when we're trying to spell out DF claim, we might think of it as follows. If A is a paradigmatic intentional action, then an RE question is given application to A. Now, I think there are a number of problems. One is that it's not clear to me why an intentional action for reasons is the paradigmatic case of intentional action. And sometimes claims like DF claim are used as sort of starting assumptions about kind of intentional action and about a kind of a relationship that it bears to a social practice. But now we have a sort of very substantial assumption here about kind of the nature of intentional action, kind of its paradigmatic cases are those that are done for reasons. But when we think about intentional actions that are not done for reasons, you have successful exercise of control, such as guidance control. You have like the knowing tokening of an act type, the employment of knowledge how, you might have practical knowledge. So it's at least not obvious why action for reasons is the paradigmatic case of intentional action. But you might still have that strong kind of intuition or thought. There is something paradigmatic about intentional action. And what I want to briefly suggest in the last minute or two is that there's an alternative explanation for that judgment or thought that you might have. And that alternative explanation, if it's correct, it undermines DF claim. At least it undermines the sort of theoretical ambition of DF claim. And the idea is that some agents are very sophisticated, like ourselves. We have sophisticated, rational, epistemic, practical, moral capacities. We live in complex social settings. And when we perform intentional actions, we usually perform them for reasons, broadly understood as they've been understood throughout the talk. So when such agents act intentionally without acting for reasons, when we do something for no reason, like raising our hand, for example, that action is non-paradigmatic for this kind of agent. And what I want to suggest is that it's not clear that it's non-paradigmatic qua intentional action. It's not a sort of a defective case of intentional action. It's just a defective intentional action given the kind of agent who's producing it. Namely, or at least this may be sort of informing our judgment that intentional action for reasons are the paradigmatic case of intentional action. It's that they're the paradigmatic case for agents like us, for example, or other agents who have these capacities. When we do something as effortful or as consequential as performing an intentional action, we ordinarily do it for reasons, and when we don't, it might be that it's sort of non-paradigmatic for us or for sophisticated agents. But if this alternative explanation of our judgment that intentional action is for reasons is paradigmatic is correct, then DF claim para might be true, but it doesn't illuminate the nature or concept of intentional action. It illuminates instead the relationship between ORI questions and the typical thought processes that are involved in intentional action when the agent is a sophisticated agent. Okay. So the theoretical ambition of DF claim is to sort of illuminate intentional action by reference to the ORI practice. But if this explanation is on the right track, then if anything is getting illuminated by the ORI practice, it's the capacities of the agents who are performing the intentional actions. So the ORI practice isn't obviously going to be sort of some kind of a useful mirror or illuminating device for understanding the nature or concept of intentional action. And it's worth noting that in social contexts, we engage in, and of course, we've been talking about this all week, we routinely inquire into not only sophisticated agents' reasons for intentional action, but their reasons for beliefs, their intentions, their policies, their preferences, their practical roles, their valued attitudes, even emotional responses. We ask why for all of these kinds of things, and we try to elicit reasons from agents. And we might ask, is it in the natures of these diverse things that sort of explains the fittingness of the why questions or the reasons inquiries to them? Put another way, should we think that the ORI inquiries will be especially illuminating about the natures of these things, beliefs, intentions, commitments, practical roles? And I guess my thought is the more economical idea is surely that these kinds of inquiries are fitting to the kinds of agents that sophisticated agents, for example, who have beliefs and practical rules and commitments and policies on the basis of reasons broadly understood. And so the idea is, I guess, that ORI inquiry as applied to intentional action is just one subspecies of lots of different kind of reason-seeking inquiries. And we shouldn't expect that ORI inquiry as applied to intentional action is going to be especially illuminating about the nature or concept of intentional action. So ORI questions are not best understood as particularly intimately related to and decisively shaped by intentional action. And so the sort of the theoretical ambition of DF claim is I think undermined if this kind of explanatory view is accepted. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, let's start with a discussion. I would like to ask you if yeah, great. You have a question in the audience?
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I do have one question. I'm not completely sure how it bears on your argument, but as I understood Anscombe, and at least people like Michael Thompson, for example, are very much inspired by Anscombe's work. And I think their general view of what reasons are might be a bit different. So it's not so much about our social practice of giving reasons, but it's more about asking why questions brings out the order of the means and order of intentional actions. So it's more like the reason that I break this egg is that I'm baking an omelette, or the reason that I walk up the stairs is to get a cup of coffee. So I'm not completely sure how tightly connect, or at least people that are inspired by Anscombe, how tightly they connect the social practice to reasons for action, or at least, yeah. So that's my question. How do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a great question. And I certainly am wading into kind of not one really, but like a couple of large literatures on this issue. And I'm sort of taking as a jumping off point what Anscombe says. And I think a claim that maybe not Michael Thompson, but I think a lot of philosophers in roughly analytic philosophy might accept, which is that there is some very tight connection between our inquiry and our intentional actions. And I guess the bigger question is, well, what's the relationship? And I do think that when Anscombe says that, you know, the why question is a question that elicits reasons, I do think that she thinks that what we're eliciting really is the means and practical reasoning in our thought as we perform our intentional actions. And I want to sort of grant, when I was saying that reasons are to be broadly understood here, I want to sort of grant that Anscomian view. But I guess I want to sort of be as open-ended as possible about what's being elicited. So it could be like the means and order of our actions that's elicited. But I also take it that there is this kind of ambition to understand intentional action or to shed light on intentional action by appeal to these questions and what's elicited by them. But actually, I think the questions are sort of fitting to agents like us, and the questions are a subspecies of a larger practice. So there is this kind of, because many of our intentional actions have a means and order, but not all of them, these questions will be fitting to our actions. But these kinds of questions are also questions that are being asked about beliefs and intentions and policies. So there isn't a kind of a neat fit. And I think that Anscombe, and I think some other philosophers of action, think that there is a quite neat fit between kind of action explanation and intentional action. So that, but I think that actually the fit has to do with our the relationship between the questions and our capacities as rational agents. And just to sort of, I guess I disagree. There's a kind of neatness to Michael Thompson's view in particular, where he says that we're eliciting the means and order. And I think that actually sometimes when we get a true direct answer to our ORI question, we elicit information about lots of different things that are not necessarily connected to the means and order. So for example, somebody might say, why are you feeding Anna? And I say, well, I'm her mother. So here I talk about my practical role, and I might gesture towards kind of obligations or requirements that I'm under. And it's not always clear that you're going to reveal a means and order. If a means and order is revealed, then it's going to be a sort of a very a very substantial understanding of means and order that might not fit well with how we would like to characterize practical reasoning. But there's a bigger, those are bigger issues in the background, just to sort of gesture at the fact that I don't fully agree with the sort of the neatness of the picture that we see in Michael Thompson. But I'm not sure whether I answered your question in my rather long rambling answer. It's hard when I can't even see your, I can't see you. You look very small.
Yeah, that's strange. No, it's definitely an answer to my question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions? It seems there is no question on Zoom, maybe in the audience. If not, I would like to thank our speaker again